right? 2 Kings 24, always a popular scripture for sermons, right? So this is a confusing time in the church here. And it's confusing because during this year, we've been following Matthew. And right, so the church year starts out in Advent, and it works its way right through the year, which means that as we get toward the end, or we're getting toward the end of the church year, as we get toward the end, we're sort of heading toward the cross. So that's where our scriptures are going, is it's heading toward Good Friday and Easter, which doesn't fit with what's going on right in the rest of well in our calendar, right? So while our texts, our gospel texts are heading toward Easter, me and the worship team are starting to think about Advent. So we're heading toward Christmas, and it's a confusing time of the year, and while our scriptures are heading toward Easter, and our worship team is heading toward Christmas, the rest of us are caught up in a pandemic election. So if you're confused about what's going on about all of this, it probably means you're paying attention. Usually, as some of you probably know, usually I dislike early Christmas stuff. That I think, we should start celebrating Christmas about December 21st or 2nd or something like that. When we were in Ghana, they would start celebrating Christmas about December 25th, which suited me just fine. But I may regret this, but this year, I'm okay with early Christmas. We can start now. And that little squeal of joy you heard in the background is probably Deb, because she's going to start with Handel's Messiah tomorrow, or maybe this afternoon. We'll see how it goes. But right now, I think we need all the peace on earth, goodwill toward all that we can possibly get. It's time to start Christmas. And what we don't need is more talk about blood sacrifice or the need to suffer for sin, because there's enough suffering going on right now all around us, and it's going to happen, but suffering is not the goal, and it doesn't need to be glorified. It's also important that we approach especially the next month, with our eyes wide open and with our hearts as wide open as we can get them. And I know it's tempting, right, just to sort of hunker down and turn off all your electronics and bury your head in the sand. But I don't think that's what we're supposed to be doing. And our texts are also doing that. They're also keeping their eyes wide open as they try to figure out what's going on. And so that's why we read this fascinating piece from 2 Kings this morning. That this is a piece toward the end of the time of the kings of Israel. And this writer, he's writing like many, many years later. So he knows what's going to happen. He knows where it's going to go. And where it's going to go is that the Babylonians are going to show up and they're going to destroy Jerusalem, and they're going to destroy the kingdom of Judah. And it's going to be the end for the kings. And this is the year like 587 BC. And the next time Israel's going to have a king is like about 100 CE. So it's going to be like 400 years before Israel has king. And it's going to have a king very briefly then. And it's not going to have a king ever again, right? So now he doesn't know all of this history, but he knows that in his day, it's been a long time since there's been a king. And he also knows that God appointed these kings and he gave them this guarantee of power. He said, I'm going to put a descendant of David on the throne for like ever, as long as they do a few basic things, one of which is bringing justice. And so it's like this early advertisement for like, just do your job. Okay. And all the king has to do is basically provide, actually the king has to provide injustice, right? Because he's supposed to decide for the poor, which is not justice. It's sort of, right? It's injustice, but it's injustice for the poor rather than injustice for the rich. Anyway, right? But he's supposed to provide, right, basic goodness, right? Following the covenant, and they can't manage. And so stuff happens. So he's looking back on his history and going, wow, we really messed up. And I'm just going to tell that story. And the Matthew passage that we read also is tempting to do the same kind of thing, right? That Matthew is trying to look at two realities at the same time, one of which is in the past and one of which is in his present. And he's trying to use these two realities and he's trying to figure out the future. So, and he knows, Matthew knows that the past is mixed because on the one hand, God came to earth. Wow, right? Jesus, right, was like God coming to earth and saying, look, here's how you do this whole thing. Right? And if you do this whole thing the way you're supposed to, the way I created this world to be, it's going to be okay. It's going to work. So that's the really good part of the past. And the other thing that Matthew knows is that Jesus was brutally executed by the civil and religious authorities. Right? Easter, right? Good Friday is coming. Matthew keeps telling us. And it's not just that. It's not just that Jesus was brutally executed by the civil and religious authorities, but God didn't intervene. God just said, yep, guess that's what's going to happen. God let it happen for whatever reason. And not only did Jesus get executed and God let it happen, but the people didn't rise up. Right? Maybe there could have been a revolution. Maybe this event could have brought on a revolution, but it didn't. And even the disciples, at best we can say they stood by it and watched, but really, no, they just sort of ran away and hid. So that's a pretty mixed past in a lot of ways. And then Matthew's also looking at the reality of his current situation, and as best we understand it, his present is kind of mixed, but again, mostly bleak. On the one hand, the church in Matthew's day is growing, but there's also at least some sporadic persecution. And it's certainly true that mostly the church is being rejected by Jesus' own people. We also remember from last week that Jerusalem has just been destroyed, and Judaism is kind of circling the wagons now, and the church is outside. So that's what Matthew's trying to do in his general gospel, is trying to tell this story all at the same time and trying to figure out how does this story help us move forward as a church. And in a lot of ways right now, as American Christians, we find ourselves in a similar situation. That as we look to the past of the American church, we can probably kindly say that the past is mixed. That how we tell the story of American Christianity really depends on who is telling the story. We can say all of the nice things and the good things that the church has done. We can equally true say all of the horrible things that the church has done throughout history. So let's just call it mixed for now. That's the past. And the present, I think like Matthew's present, is mixed but mostly bleak. And it's mostly bleak because the church is in decline. And even if it isn't, there's so often during the week when it's kind of embarrassing to be a Christian. It really is, because of what specific Christian leaders keep doing and saying, even while regular, ordinary folks like you and I keep trying to follow Jesus as best we can. The people who make the news are just embarrassing way too often. So that's where we find ourselves. Plus, of course, in the midst of a pandemic election, which was sort of hard to forget. So in all of this, what does our little story in Matthew try to teach us? Well, the first thing that Jesus says, right? So they come to him and they say, how should we participate in this system, in this evil system? They knew it was an evil system. Everybody knew that, right? Even the people benefiting probably knew it was an evil system. But how do we participate, the rest of us ordinary folk? Should we pay taxes or not? And Matthew says, well, bring me a coin. And they brought him a coin. And they said, whose picture's on it? They said, it's Caesar's picture. And so immediately, first lesson is, you are in this system whether you like it or not. The fact that you have a coin means that you are in this system, right? So that's the first thing to remember, right? We are part of the system, right? We are part of this whole American system, whether we like it or not, right? But even as we say this, we have to remember that one of our options, therefore, is that we don't have to like it. Right? We can be a system and still say, well, this is a horrible system that I'm part of. This is a decision we make. So Jesus says, look, you've got this coin, right? Give to Caesar what is Caesar's. And, right, therefore pay your taxes. Except that he doesn't stop there. He goes on to say, and, right, give to God what is God's, which sort of totally throws off the first part, right? You know, he always sort of gives the easy answer first, and then Jesus often throws in the complicated answer, the complicating factor next. And it's the giving to God part, right? Because we're supposed to be the people whose first commitment is to God. And if our first commitment is to God, then this has consequences, right? Not just for our taxes, but for everything else we do during the week. And this means that we get to choose how we're going to participate, right? We don't have to say, well, here's the two options we're given, or here's the one option we're given. We're just going to do this. No, right? We get to choose how we participate because we have a prior commitment to God. We have a first commitment to God. The next thing we learn is that gaining and keeping earthly power is itself an unworthy goal. In the passage we read from Kings, there was a system that God had set up, right? And God said, you know, maybe if I give the leaders guaranteed power so that they don't have to do anything to get power, they don't have to do anything to keep power. All they have to do is basic justice, right? And even if they don't do that, they get power. So like, why wouldn't they do that, right? And even that doesn't work, right? And eventually, right, the people of Israel figured out that this whole earthly power thing, it's just not a worthy goal. God tried to guarantee a one-party state, and it didn't work. Even God couldn't pull off a one-party state. Matthew is also looking back on Jesus' death, and he realizes that the Jesus movement survived even that, right? So like whatever it is you think we're going through right now, nationally or regionally or locally, the early church went through something a lot worse. It survived the death of Jesus. It survived the execution of Jesus, right? And sure, yeah, the Easter was great, right? But it still, right, was trying to do without Jesus. Jesus was gone. So if the early church can survive and did survive the death of Jesus, we as a church, we as a group will survive this election and this pandemic and whatever comes after it. Right? Somehow, right? Exactly what we look like, we don't know. We have to determine that. We have to make decisions as to how we're going to survive and what we're going to survive as. But right, I think if the early church survived the death of Jesus, we're going to survive. And in the meantime, we have to act on our convictions. If everything belongs to God, how then do we live? How do we survive this pandemic? How do we move forward? And one of the cool things that Matthew does, even in the middle of this chaos that he's living in, is to end his gospel on this note of triumph, not where you'd expect him to end. You might expect him to go, well, just hang in there, folks. Do the best you can, right? Keep your head down. Don't make any waves. Right? We'll sort of tough this one out together. But that's not how Matthew ends. Matthew ends with probably one of the most famous pieces in all of Matthew, right? Go into all the world and proclaim, right? Shout it out, say it loud, good news to everybody, right? Baptize, teach all of these things. And finally, right? Lo, I am with you always, even to the close of the age. Last week, I suggested maybe we should memorize Philippians 4:4-7, right? Rejoice in the Lord always. But here's another one, right? Here's another one that's really worth hanging on to, right? You don't have to, you know, whatever you think about go into all the world. you still always have this last verse to hang on to. Lo, I am with you always, even to the close of the age. So that's what I want you to think about in our breakout groups. I want you to think about lo. You can do without the lo, but it's sort of there. It's kind of poetic, right? I am with you always, even to the close of the age, right? How's that going to affect you in the next few weeks as we deal with a pandemic election? So, Philip.